Well, quite simply, and it had to be done, that's not a knife, this is a knife. Hi, it's Todd from Todd's Workshop and Todd Cutler here, and today we are going to talk about this. So what is it? Well, it is, quite simply, a giant Scottish dirk, done in the style of the early 18th century. And what am I doing with this thing? And did it even exist? And just, there are so many questions. Well, the first thing I have to say is no, it didn't exist. So these giant-sized dirks, these sword-sized dirks, these swirks, were never a thing. But what it's really about is using this as a vehicle to talk about scale, size, proportion, what you see in the museums, what you see in the reproduction market, what you want as a customer, what I want to make as a maker who's passionate about history. Because this will allow us to talk about that. So please join in the discussions because it's a really very real one. So we're going to come back and look at another couple of daggers and swords, and then we're going to talk about this. I have a fistful of Todd Cutler daggers here. It's not a sales pitch, this is to explain what's going on. So we're going to start now with this quillen dagger here. It's got a grip on it. It absolutely encloses your hand between the pommel and the guard. It allows you a really secure grip, really good edge alignment. You know where this knife is, you know you're not going to let go of it. That is pretty much true to what you see in the museums. Rondels, like this one, very often a slightly longer grip, probably because these were more likely to be worn with gauntlets, need a bit more room in it. But even so, the gauntlet sometimes seems to enclose over the top pommel, so your whole top of your hand is completely armoured. But it does mean you need a slightly bigger grip. Again, this is pretty much true to what you find in museums. Then we have a bollock dagger here. Handles again can be quite small, but again, it's the same old story. You're locking your hand in, really good edge alignment, really know that it's there and it's staying there. When you look at this sort of thing, you don't look at that and go, oh, that's the grip length. That's not the grip length. The grip length is the whole handle. That's really how it is. And you see that again and again in museums. And you will always see that argument of, oh, well, people were smaller then. Well, actually, on average, probably quite a lot of people were. But, you know, if you just chop off, let's say, 10 centimetres, 4 inches off the average height, actually you can then relate that to the average size of a hand, and you'll find that actually the average width of a hand was only sort of 5-ish, 6-ish millimetres, quarter of an inch less, maybe, at the worst case scenario. So that's not really why they're going for such small handles. And then we come to this dirk here. Now, you look at that, you're probably fairly familiar with this kind of thing. It is a dirk-sized dirk, but actually it's not. It's a cheat. That distance there is about 1.5 centimetres, maybe a little bit more, bigger than it should be. So it's small enough that it's held dirk proportions and it looks like a dirk. It still locks you in there exactly as a dirk should be, so it's a good knife, but it is, in truth, actually a longer grip than it should be. But this is where it becomes difficult, because if I made that with a very small grip, a dirk-sized grip, people would look at the stats on the site and they would go, oh, it's too small, I'm not buying that. I have to make this different, a little bit longer, to be able to make my living. And that's an interesting choice I've made. Now, on a long-bladed knife, not so difficult. Shorter bladed knives, it becomes much harder, but we're going to talk about that in a moment. So don't just take my word for it, go get this book. It is by the appropriately named John Wallace. And if you're interested in Scottish weapons and stuff, fantastic. But we start with this one here, and it's a dirk. And you go, well, that's all right. You know, you've got a proportionately sized handle. But actually, that's only a 12.5-inch blade, so about the same size as that one I just showed you. And that means that that handle is really quite small. Now, if we come to this picture here, which is number 58, and this is basically the target of this film here. Nice, early 18th century dirk. It's got the brass hilt at the bottom, brass pommel at the top, and a little spacer in between. Quite a normal style for that period. So what happens if you take this bone element here, right, which I can tell you on the original is just over 2 inches. What happens if you scale that up to the far more reasonable 10 centimetres, 4 inches? So you want a 4-inch grip. Most people go, okay, I want a 4-inch grip. Well, what you end up with is the Swirk. It is this bonkers thing here. So that grip element is 10 centimetres. If you look at those pictures and you think, this is what I need to grip, this is what you end up with, all right? And it may be lovely, I actually kind of like it. but it's not right. Now, if I showed you a picture of that here now, you're probably looking at that and going, well, proportionally it looks fine. But actually, I've made some really significant changes, really significant. So if we start with these two, have a look at them. They're basically a scale of 1 and a scale of 2 on the height. But that's kind of where it ends. Because if I had doubled the width of that actual proper size dirk on the handle, I'd end up with something that I couldn't really hold. So actually I've taken it as big as I'm comfortable with, and it's still feeling okay in the hand. So then if we look at this element here, the guard, if I doubled that up on scale, it's going to end up being around about 3 inches wide. Same with the pommel. That's going to give you so much mass in there, it's just not really going to be functional. And then we have the blade. Again, that was going to be about 2 3/4 inches, about 80 millimeters wide. Well, that's a wide blade, it's not unheard of, but you scale it up and you go from about 1/4 inch to about 1/2 inch. So from about 6 mil to about 12 mil. That again, especially on a single hander, is just not going to be tenable. And I wanted this as an exercise to try and make a real object. So this has been made for this film. It doesn't mean that it's just a prop. It really is a real weapon. I made it to be a real weapon. I set out to make it a real weapon, and that is really specific in some of the choices and the changes I made. This is a usable sword, which, you know, it's got blade presence, but it is a perfectly wieldable, perfectly usable sword. And that was the idea behind it. But to do that, I had to make choices to make it look like a dirk. It screams dirk at you, but the sizes were never there. But you have to make these compromises in an extremely inflated, exaggerated way here to show you really what is happening when you make a choice as a weapons reproducer. You have to make something that works. If I delivered to you a dirk with a 10 centimeter grip, this would be the result. Not quite right, is it? So both of these objects visually say dirk, but what happens when you lay them side by side with the original picture? So now you can see that actually they are really quite different things. The Swirk obviously is a different case entirely, but the smaller reproduction dirk dagger I did, you can see how that differs from the original, and basically how I'm trying to make it more appealing to what people think a modern usage of a knife should be and how you grip it. So I made some subtle changes to the proportion of that dirk to try and make it more saleable. But actually, dirks are relatively easy to deal with because they've got long blades on them. And the thing is, the longer the blade, the more mass is out here to sort of counterbalance the hilt. So when you wear it in a sheath on your belt, it stays upright. The shorter the blade, the harder it is to get that balance to keep the knife staying upright. But these size and proportion changes are much easier when the blade is a bit longer. And a dirk is a really good one for that. So actually you can mess about with the proportions of a dirk and it doesn't make too much difference. You can see it slightly in the grip length, but actually it still functions as a knife. It still sits upright in a sheath, which is of course what you want in a knife. You don't want it to overbalance, with the exception of a few rondels in the late 15th, but that's another film. But the thing is, if we look at a dagger like this one here and we go, well, I want a longer grip. If you go, right, well, I want to move that pommel up another inch, another 2.5 centimeters. Well, now you've got a big mass out the top there, and that's much more likely to overbalance your knife. So now when you put it in a sheath on your belt, it does that. Well, that's no good. So what you do is you make the blade a bit longer. Well, now proportionally it looks a bit odd. So you think, well, okay, I'm going to have to make the guard a bit wider. So you make the guard wider, and now the handle looks skinny, so you make the handle a little bit bigger. And now actually the pommel looks like too small again. It's just this tiny little pimple on the end, so you have to make the pommel bigger. So now you make the pommel bigger, you've got more mass there. So you're back to where you were, and you think, well, what I'll do is I'll make a bigger blade. And then you'll do that, and then, you know what? Sooner or later, the person doing that is going to give up. And they're going to go, it's good enough. Well, you know what? It's not good enough for me. Because the thing is, I think it has to function as a weapon, so it has to actually be right. It has to look nice, because ugly things are, who wants them? You know, and it needs to look like the things in museums. And I think often that is the case where we're reproducing things and we drift away from the core thing right at the beginning is what is the thing I am actually trying to make. And the thing is, let's not forget that the medieval and Renaissance people who made these, commissioned them, used them, trained with them, they lived and died by them. These were their objects that they knew and trusted and used. Who am I to tell them that they got it wrong? Really? Now, I can fudge the odd detail to make something more saleable, but fundamentally, they designed something the way it was because that was the way it needed to be. So really, that's what it's about. The dirk, the swirk, this crazy big thing here, it's just a vehicle to talk about it. And it's kind of a fun thing, and I enjoyed making it. But that aside, I'm just going to do it one more time. That's not a knife. That is a knife. Anyway, I'll see you again. I hope you enjoyed it. Cheers.